Hello, my name's Ewan Russell Jones, and it's very good to welcome you to another conversation about books. Today we're talking with Os Guinness about his new book, The Magna Carta of Humanity, Sinai's Revolutionary Faith and the Future of Freedom, published by IVP. Welcome, Os. It's great to see you.
Thank you, Ewan. Great pleasure to be with you and with a Regent audience.
Thanks for joining us. Way back in the dim and distant past, Os and I were contemporaries at Oxford University, though he was in every sense the senior man and already the respected author of a number of books. Since then, he's gone on to become an internationally recognized Christian thinker and speaker and a fellow at a number of prominent American research institutions. He's written widely on issues concerning faith and contemporary culture, especially on fundamental human rights. But it may be that this, his latest book, The Magna Carta of Humanity, is his most provocative and controversial so far, concerned as it is not only with Sinai and the revolutionary faith, but with specific aspects of the current American political crisis. And we'll certainly be exploring some of those themes as we go along. But Os, while large parts of the book are about the USA, you begin with a memory from your childhood in China. Why is that story important to you? Why do you begin there?
Well, it was a dramatic day in my life. You know, I was born in China. My first 10 years were there. And we lived with the war and with violence and famine. My two brothers had died there. But then we moved to Nanking. So I remember the encircling Red Army. But I'll never forget that day my dad said to me, "Son, we're in trouble. Chiang Kai-shek has just abandoned the city and we're at the mercy of the Red Army." But as I say in the book, many years later, about the time you and I knew each other, I was a graduate student at Oxford, and my tutor was at All Souls. And one night when I was there, I met Sir Isaiah Berlin, the great Jewish philosopher of freedom. And as we talked, he was fascinating. It turned out he'd been a 7-year-old in the Russian Revolution, and I'd been a 7-year-old in the Chinese Revolution, the two great communist revolutions of the 20th century. And as we talked, we both, as it were, thank God that the English-speaking people had stood against totalitarianism. But no one in that time, this is 1975, would have guessed that America would have any encroachment of the radical left, because Americanism was seen as the surrogate to socialism and communism. But you can see how things have changed.
Yeah, so I mean that period in your life and your parents' life as well, really, really significant. They were under house arrest for a while. When you know, after the revolution, they weren't allowed out of China.
I was kept with them for 2 years, so I experienced some of it. My dad was tried publicly, but it was all cooked up and the charges fell apart. After they were allowed to entrust me to a colleague of theirs who took me out to Hong Kong and I flew back to Britain, you know, they were kept another 2 years. The communists said, "Pack your stuff and leave at the weekend." And so they sent everything except a change of clothes and a Bible and a hymn book. And they were kept like that under house arrest. Fortunately, they adored each other. And by the end of those 2 years, they'd learned 3/4 of the Bible by heart.
Oh, well.
And they were finally allowed out.
Yeah, so I mean, a profound kind of impact on your life there. And then in terms of reflecting on the nature of modern culture, modern society, and freedom especially, you've latched in this book, and the kind of central chapters of the book are really about Exodus, aren't they? A kind of exposition of what you call this revolutionary faith. So could you know, obviously, you know, you can't read the book to us, but we need to read it for ourselves. But you can you unpack why you think this is so critical for an understanding, a true understanding of humanity and of freedom?
Well, go back, Ewan, to the time you and I were together at Oxford. You did your studies in the 17th century. As you probably know, the climax of the American Revolutionary War was Yorktown, 1781. And when the British and the Hessian troops were ordered to surrender, they were asked to march out and play the tune, "The World Turned Upside Down," which, as you know, came from the 17th century, and much of its roots were biblical. As the rabbis put it, God creates order, humans create disorder. So when God works into a disordered world, he turns it the right way up. And that's actually the biblical view of revolution. Now, you could expand on that at great length, but clearly take the 5 big revolutions: English, American, Russian, and Chinese, and of course, the French. The first 2 look different. The English failed, the lost cause. The Americans succeeded. But they're actually very close because both of them came out of the Reformation. And the 17th century obsession with the Hebrew Republic and all that that meant. So many Americans have no idea that their Constitution comes from the Hebrew covenant through the Reformation. And that's why I think it's so important, because the ideas of the covenant give you a deep, rich view of freedom, which was originally America's view, which has simply been lost today. So as I see it, the crisis in America's shifted from the ideas coming from the American Revolution to the heirs of ideas that come from the French Revolution, because postmodernism outwards and so on, they are heirs of 1789, not 1776.
So what specifically are the characteristic features of the Sinai Revolution that you believe come through the English Revolution and the American Revolution?
Well, as you know, Reinhold Niebuhr would say there are 2 bookends of history politically. At one extreme, authoritarianism, all order, no freedom. At the other extreme, anarchy, all freedom, no order. The second is unlivable and almost inevitably leads to the first, authoritarianism. Now, the American experiment, going back to Sinai, is between those 2. It's an ordered freedom. The Lord frees them. They are set free to be free, but it's within the covenant. And you have Jewish scholars like Daniel Elazar, who 50 years ago put the idea of covenant back onto the political scene. So as he put it, there's more than just, the Greek ideas: monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, and their 3 corrupt forms. No, he said you've got to look at societies, how they're founded. So you begin with organic societies. They're rather like a family, linked by blood and ties of kinship: a Scottish clan, African tribe, a country like Lebanon. Then you have the main type, hierarchical, linked by power, a kingdom, an empire, the Catholic Church. But you have in Scripture this third type, covenantal. And as he unpacked it, there are 3 parts of it that were so critical to what became the constitutional discussion of freedom. First, the covenant was a matter of freely chosen consent. As you know well, 3 times in Exodus, it says, all that the Lord says, we will do. Michael Walzer of Princeton calls this an almost democracy. The second feature, a morally binding pledge. A covenant is more than a contract. A contract is all about an overlapping self-interest with no real interest of the parties for each other. If the interests diverge, the contract is gone. It's narrow and limited. A covenant is comprehensive and lasting. Take marriage till death do us part. And the third thing is, you have in a covenant the reciprocal responsibility of everyone for everyone. The Jewish phrase, every Jew is responsible for every Jew, solidarity, and so on. So those things you see discussed in the Swiss Reformation, Bullinger and Zwingli, going down to Knox and Cromwell. Cromwell says the Exodus is the direct parallel to what he's trying to do in England, and he failed. And of course, the Mayflower Compact was a covenant, and the covenant started to shape New England. And the first constitution, which is the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, John Adams wrote it. He says it is a covenant. So that covenantal idea lies behind America, but of course, largely gone today.
Yeah, so I mean, we'll come back to that issue in a moment. But this you refer to the Book of Exodus as a kind of great classic, a great saga, greater than Homer's Iliad and Virgil's Odyssey, and you've kind of drawn very heavily on two Jewish thinkers, Abraham Heschel and particularly on Jonathan Sacks. What drew you especially to those authors when you were kind of unraveling these themes?
Well, actually, it was a friend in Oxford, Tom Houston, who used to be with World Vision, who put me on to Daniel Elazar 10 years ago. And it was Elazar and his 10 books on covenant that opened it up for me. But while he did it in a scholarly way, the one whom I found did it best, covenant in the Bible, was Rabbi Sacks. So I literally read every book that he wrote. And I wanted to put his thinking on the map for evangelicals in particular, who probably didn't know Rabbi Sacks. And so I dedicated to him and expounded many of his ideas deliberately. And when I did that, I wrote to him. He wrote an amazing letter back to me. Sadly, before the book came out, he was diagnosed and then he died of cancer. So he never saw the final result. But his widow wrote me a very moving email thanking me for what I'd done. But if you read Rabbi Sacks, his commentaries on the Torah, Covenant and Conversation, the one on Exodus, is rich with understanding freedom. So I take many of my evangelical friends here in America. They read Exodus, yes, but it's all spiritual. It's all personal. It's the prefiguring of my salvation, what Jesus did for me. No. In the 17th century, as you know well, Ewan, from your studies, it shaped the understanding of the English Revolution and eventually the American Revolution. So we got to look at it critically, including the fact that, of course, the Americans enshrined a contradiction, a hypocrisy, an evil right at the heart of what they were doing with slavery. So that's a denial of everything you see in Exodus. But the roots are so important, and I'm looking to the future. Can we, if Western civilization collapses and we go towards the world of singularity and all that's promised us with the menace of Chinese totalitarianism at one extreme, can we really be proponents of a just, free, fully human, stable, peaceful societies in the future? We can't propose something like that unless we really do serious work on what Exodus was about.
So you've already kind of introduced what is the kind of organizing idea of your book, which, you know, the core of it is this exposition of freedom as it comes from Sinai, as it were. But the kind of organizing idea of the book is this contrast, this very sharp contrast you make between 1776, the American Revolution, and 1789, the French Revolution. And you say that these are actually two mutually exclusive views of America, views of the world, really. Is that really the case?
Absolutely. I mean, you've got to look at the differences. Two different sources, one the Bible, the other the French Enlightenment. Two very different views of humanity. The biblical view, realism, because of sin, you think of John Witherspoon teaching James Madison, that leads to the separation of powers, checks and balances. Why? The potential for the abuse of power. The French Revolution, utopian. Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And go on down the line, point after point after point. They're dramatically different. And I would argue, say, freedom. I think it's startling that modern secularism, I'm talking about the French Revolution now, secularism has no foundation for human freedom. So it's not just the French, but you think of J.B. Watson or Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens or Sam Harris. They only have naturalistic science. You can't find freedom through naturalistic science. The only strong view of freedom is not in the Babylonians or the Greeks or the Persians or modern atheism. It's in the Bible.
I know you want to draw this sharp division, but actually, historically, there were links between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. And there was kind of borrowings, weren't there? I mean, Jefferson spent time in France.
That's not true. That's absolutely not true. Thomas Jefferson.
Doesn't the French Declaration of the Rights of Man actually kind of depend to a degree upon the Bill of Rights and the U.S. Constitution?
No, as there you say they're borrowing from the American Revolution.
Yeah.
But in history, the French Revolution has been much more influential because of its various outflows. But the American Revolution didn't borrow French ideas, with the great exception of Thomas Paine, who wasn't at the heart of things, and Thomas Jefferson.
But you in the book, you actually point out, and you quote Jonathan Sacks on this, you know, that very famous phrase about, you know, the we declare it. What's the exact phrase about the? It's self-evident. It's self-evident that all men are created equal. Jonathan Sacks says, well, no, it's not self-evident. It wasn't self-evident to Plato. It wasn't, it's not self-evident to, and yet that itself is an idea that comes out of the Enlightenment. It comes out of France.
No. Jefferson actually quotes the Creator there.
Well, he was on to do that, but we declare it self-evident.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's self-evident.
Well, you don't think it is, but I mean, clearly there were influences there, intellectual influences, weren't there?
But no, I'd say Jefferson was the man who was most enamored with the French Revolution. And he has some alarming statements about the blood of tyrants nourishing the tree of liberty and that sort of stuff, which people still put on their sweatshirts today. I've got that in the previous book. But when he ran for the president, he renounced many of those ideas because Washington and Madison and almost all the others, Adams, realized the French Revolution was incredibly different. Now, when it comes to the radical left, I think the big difference now is over justice. Unlike freedom, both the left and the church, we speak passionately of justice and fight injustice. But when you just ask how we address them, the difference is a night and day.
Yeah, well, and this issue of the left, and I've got to declare an interest here because, historically, my own sympathies, that's where they are, basically. I'm not a conservative in politics. I would sympathize with many of the kind of movements on the left of politics generally. I totally get your critique. I totally get your critique of various things. I mean, what you do, you drive this hard line between worldviews here, which I think is both unhistorical and unhelpful. I mean, you say that socialism comes from the Paris Revolution. Now that of course the language of certain things.
Wait a minute.
Yeah.
No, I don't. You're talking about, say, British socialism, which has different roots, including the Protestant.
But you don't make that. You don't make that.
My book is about America. It's not about Britain.
You
It's
talk
not
about
about
socialism, however.
no,
You
no.
know,
I'm
that's,
talking about socialism in America. It's not generally socialism. We're talking about a radical socialism here.
you make a very strong identification, Oz, between the left and Marxism.
I'm talking about, I make a very strong difference between liberals, whom I support, and the left. And the radical left in America is very close to Marxism. And we're talking about America, Ewan, be fair.
You do use that term radical left sometimes, but a lot of it is the left. Leftist ideas come from Paris and then got nothing to do with the American Revolution of 1776.
I don't think anyone here has disagreed with that because we're talking about America, not Canada, and certainly not Britain, where the nonconformist conscience is a very key part of socialism, which is very different. We're talking about the American radical left and its roots today and the way it easily slips over into cultural Marxism. And many Americans, you take Max Dupree's famous line, the first duty of a leader is to define reality. Americans don't define their own crisis. So the present president talks about restoring the soul, the previous one, make America great again. Neither of them address what made America great in the first place and the differences between that and modern ideas. Even say the current discussion in Washington, saving democracy. The American founders didn't stress democracy. They were extremely wary of it. In other words, the republic coming from the Reformation was a very different animal. So actually, I'm back, I think, closer to what the early Americans understood. And I'm not talking about Canada, and I'm not talking about Britain. And in America, the radical left does have ideas that come down from cultural Marxism, Gramsci, and so on.
Well, I'm sure the British left does as well, and you know, and even Christian socialists, you know, would derive some of it. Would say these are useful ideas. You think of a guy like in France, like Jacques Ellul, deep Christian thinker, was influenced by Marxism at a very early stage, and while he was a critic of Marx, he never gave up certain ideas that he said he'd learned from Marx. What is wrong about that?
We can learn from anyone. I have actually a letter from Jacques Ellul, who liked my first book so much. So I followed him too, and I'm a great admirer of him, and so on. We can learn from anyone, and certainly from Gramsci and others. The whole notion, for years, I've talked about cultural gatekeepers, and that idea comes from Gramsci. I have no problem. All truth is God's truth, so wherever there's truth, we can learn from it. That's not the problem. But if you understand what, say, the sexual revolution is about, go back to Wilhelm Reich earlier, or go back to what the radical left is about in the cultural Marxist form. They are out to subvert the American Republic. And I agree with people like Jordan Peterson on this one. You know, some of the stuff in woke business and woke finance and some of the extremes in the university are undermining the very idea of the university. And they're certainly taking on the American experiment. We're talking about America.
You're comparing a kind of whole way of thinking about the world from continental Europe with the American Revolution specifically, fine, but it goes further than I feel. And your language, even in the book, actually goes further than that. You know, you don't continually remind us. It's the left that you're critiquing. And I think that I don't find that helpful. I don't find it historical either. Let me ask you about specific movements, because you do name names in this book, and you name them, you know, it's Antifa, you know, kind of, I think this is very much in the context of the violent protest and stuff. Occupy Wall Street, but especially Black Lives Matter. That crops up at various points in the book. Why do you find Black Lives Matter so objectionable?
Because of the difference between the saying Black Lives Matter, which is unarguable, And properly understood, it's based on every human being is made in the image and likeness of God. So, of course, Black Lives Matter. The saying is unarguable, but the organization is Marxist. And they've self-professed in their honesty about that. And their ideas are very, very dangerous. And I believe friends here in Washington, they're saying this is a crisis of civility. This is a crisis of character. And I'm saying, no, those are mid-level problems. You're at a point where, rather like Jeremiah, people, and he says it twice, people are saying peace, peace, when there is no peace. In other words, the assumptions behind Black Lives Matter and the assumptions behind the first principles of the American experiment are night and day. And I think they have to be taken on roundly.
Thousands of people in America and around the world actually were deeply touched by that whole protest. They probably know nothing about the organization, have absolutely no care about it actually. But what does matter to them is the affirmation that was made in those protests.
Yeah, you could equally say the same thing about kneeling. So I'm an Arsenal fan, have been for 70 years through
I'm
thick.
sorry to hear that.
But
I'm a Liverpool, mate. Liverpool.
I know you are. When the Arsenal players knelt, they were pure and simple tackling racism. All power to them. Now, that isn't the situation here. In other words, it's quite different in Europe and different parts of the world. So for Martin Luther King, as well as for Abraham Lincoln, there were evils, slavery. Lincoln tackled it, King tackled it, Frederick Douglass tackled it. But each of them tackled it in the light of the Declaration they believed in and what Lincoln called the better angel of the American nature. And King, Martin Luther King, said that the Declaration was a promissory note. In other words, it hadn't been cashed in. That was evil. It was time to cash it in for the blacks and everyone. Now, that, I think, is the way of Christian reform, and he was a Christian pastor. But Kaepernick, when he started the kneeling movement, was disrespecting the anthem, the flag, and the Declaration itself, if you go back. In other words, I have no problem with my Arsenal team kneeling. They meant something quite different. All power to them. And many people picking up Black Lives Matter, of course. But here, you're dealing with something different. But
you can say, well, you make this distinction between the organization and then, what is a kind of worldwide movement now. But actually, there's this whole thing about because certain people identified with a particular thing happen to be Marxists, then therefore you can discredit the whole thing. I mean, that's what people will take from your book, I'm sure. They will see that as a kind of an indictment of Black Lives Matter.
It's an indictment of the organization and the organizations behind the inroads of much of woke business. This is where I think you're incredibly naive about America, although I may have been careless about not, say, qualifying it in terms of how it would be read in, Afghanistan or Africa or on English soccer pitches and football pitches. No, I understand that. But
well, maybe naive, Oz, but I mean, I know, that Martin Luther King himself, as well as Abraham Heschel, who you quote regularly in the book, were kept under surveillance for being subversives, because of their involvement with the civil rights movement, and then their opposition to the Vietnam War. And that was used by Christians to discredit the entire movement.
All right, but, I'm British and Irish. My family was strong supporters of William Wilberforce, financially and friends. So we in England, as evangelicals, the greatest abolition of all time, social reformer, was an evangelical. Over here, one of the deep problems, Americans have a very bad conscience because of the South, whether the Civil War or Jim Crow or what you're talking about too. I'm a great admirer, as you said earlier, of Abraham Heschel. Of course, but Martin Luther King was nonviolent. Now, Black Lives Matter is not nonviolent. They
He was
are
not,
out
yeah,
of a very different stable.
yeah, okay, but he was tainted by the same accusation that you're making against an entire movement.
I make clearly the difference between the saying, which is unarguable and actually needs the basis of Imago Dei to make it possible, and the movement and the founders who were Marxists. That's in the book, because the American experiment is at a very crucial stage, and I don't think a lot of Americans are addressing it.
Mm. So, yeah, I mean, the American experiment, you obviously put a lot on this, and you place a lot of emphasis on it. And you know, I'm not as kind of starry-eyed about the English Revolution as you are. I mean, Cromwell got nowhere with it, not because of you know, other people quashing it. He had no idea what to do with it. He was, you know, and where it ended up was basically in a kind of dictatorship, which became a sort of quasi-monarchy, and then the real monarchy came back. So, you know, that was a failure for you.
Where's a single thing that you in the book that says I'm starry-eyed about the English Revolution? That is just nonsense. You're reading a lot into it.
Well, no, this link that you want to make between Sinai, the direct link, you've done it, the direct link between Sinai, English Revolution, American Revolution.
Well, have you read a lot of the recent stuff like Eric Nelson and people like that? There's no question there's a very strong link. Was it perfect? No, I said the dire contradiction of slavery, for example. Are we there now? No, they've drifted from covenantalism to contractualism, and now a rather empty talk on democracy. America's in deep trouble. But some of its best leading ideas were biblical. That's all. I'm not the slightest bit starry-eyed.
You kind of present the left as the big threat to America, right? And I want to know from you what you see as the threats that are inherent in actually what's happened in American history. And I don't mean things that ideologically have kind of emerged, postmodernism and stuff like that, but the things that have actually created postmodern culture, not an ideology, but the material conditions of America that are actually come out of very strong themes within the American culture itself, maybe even implicit in the American Constitution.
Well, but not the Declaration. You're right. The Constitution had that slavery, the so-called three-fifths law, and so on. At the past, there was a Samuel Johnson said at the time, from an ocean away, as an Englishman, why is it that those yelping about freedom are the drivers of Negroes? So there's no, to quote his words, so there's no question. Now, you and I are Christians. We should stand in the prophetic tradition. Wherever people made in the image of God are abused, whether they're sold for a pair of shoes in the prophet's time or something happens today, we're against it. No question. And the tragedy in this country, America, is the church lost its prophetic critique. And they justified slavery, Jim Crow, and a lot of lynchings and a lot of horrendous things. All that's true, and I don't deny that. And it's in various books that I've written. But you're imposing, as it were, liberal left ideas from Europe on what I'm saying and missing the point about what's happening here in America.
Okay. This, you know, I simply have to hold my hands up and say, you know, fair enough. But I'm sure there are lots of people on the left in America who are Christians and who would actually be quite offended by what you're doing here. And rather than, because you mean, you claim that this is, here's this great gulf in America, these mutually exclusive ideas that, you know, have nothing to do with each other. And then there's people actually who do draw on some of these things and do find it possible to reconcile that with their Christian faith. And what are you doing then? You're actually polarizing. You're making the polarization worse.
Go back to the question I'm asked almost every week. is the right not as bad as the left? The right here in America is awful, evil, ugly, appalling. But there's one reason why the left is more dangerous, and that's what social scientists call it social location. In other words, it's strong and has the favor of people at some levels in politics, take the squad, and in bureaucracy, in the academic world and the intelligence community, and now increasingly in woke business. So I think both extremes are terrible. But the left-wing extreme is more dangerous today because of its social location. Now, I'm not quite sure of who the voices you're talking about. I live in Washington. I don't know anyone, literally not a single one at the highest level, who's speaking out in a kind of Lincolnian way. Now, there may be writers at universities, but they're not having any influence here at the highest levels of national life. Who are you thinking of these people?
Who am I thinking of on the left? Friends, people. They're not influential people. They're people who
I thought you meant
kind of in ministry, doing various things, teaching.
I have no quarrel with that if they have sincere convictions of that. And we could have a discussion as to what they think is the current danger in these things. Now, equally, I've been on calls, say, with West Coast pastors, who I would say, and I've said it to them face to face, they've drunk the Kool-Aid. And some of them had no idea, they'd never heard of cultural Marxism. You know, I live outside Washington, D.C., and you know we've got a new governor who's a Christian brother, actually a friend. But he was partly elected because of the uproar in Loudoun County over so-called CRT, critical race theory. Most people had never heard of that a year or two ago. And then when they did hear of it, they caught up fast and blamed it on something coming from Derek Bell in the Harvard Law School in the 1970s. The idea that it went back through Marcuse, through the Frankfurt School to people like Antonio Gramsci and George Lukács, they had no idea. And what I'm trying to say in the book is you got to trace some of these ideas, because when you go to the architects, they are out to subvert the Christian church and much of the West. Make no mistake.
I mean, here's your book, which is, as I say, targets the left very explicitly. I mean, it was obviously written before January the 6th. And here we have this right-wing event, clearly with a huge participation by folks who call themselves evangelicals and backing of it.
I wasn't there. I didn't agree with it. I know good friends who were in the march, who prayed and sang and were startled at the riot that took place later. So there's a huge difference between the mainstream protest, probably 85% of the people, and then that riot, which was utterly appalling.
So, but I mean, it's not just the rioting and what happened at the Capitol. It's actually that this is clearly a plot, a coup d'état, basically. That
what?
A kind of coup.
Oh,
a coup.
Come on, that's ridiculous.
Well, you don't think that any of the evidence that's coming out now about the plan to put in place alternate electors and all of this sort of thing isn't a plan to subvert democracy?
It was a terrible riot, but the idea of a coup, it was those muddle-headed coup. Actually, I don't want to get into this. You're getting into the weeds here.
Well, I mean, I may be getting into the weeds. This is the context in which your book is being read.
No, it's not. No, it's not. There are wonderful journalists, left-wing journalists like liberal journalists like Glenn Greenwald, who are passionate about truth wherever it's being contradicted, who's investigating the committee investigating January the 6th, and the story fully hasn't come out. But I would say the right is appalling. But not only that, I am an opponent of the politicization of evangelicals. In other words, much of the politicization under Trump has undermined the gospel, and I've attacked that solidly. So not for a minute do I support the right. But I do say...
I got to say, I didn't get that impression from your book. Yeah, the places where you mention Trump explicitly, it's to attack the people who are attacking him.
Because, well, no, I've often attacked Trump. And in the book I've got coming out in September, I point out, for example, that his tweets fall foul of what the Torah, the Exodus, calls evil speech and is tantamount to murder. And Christians should have spoken out against things like that, as well as I've got a proposal for 4 op-ed pieces raising questions to Trump if he should decide to run again. The second one is on his language. The first one is on his narcissism, and so on. I think as evangelicals, we've got to attack all that's wrong wherever it's wrong, and I do. But this book is on one particular topic. You know, I've written other books. I hope you've read them all. I'm sure you haven't.
I've read some of them, probably not recently, actually. The last one I would have read probably was the globalization
Square.
The public square, which I used as a text, actually, at Regent with various classes, and found it very, very, very useful. But it seems to me you're taking a different tack entirely in this book.
No, and that's on religious freedom. This book is on freedom.
It's not just on religious freedom, it's on diversity. You know, how we deal with our deepest differences. That's really the focus of that book, wasn't it?
Yeah, but not diversity as it's been used on the left again today, which often ends up in uniformity. I'm interested in liberty and diversity, which is a tough thing to bring about.
So you have to define your own, what diversity is, before you're willing to be diverse.
Of course. I mean, I would say that the human life form is the most diverse life form on planet Earth. And that's part of God's richness in creation. He's given us so many wonderful differences. So I think as Christians, we are pro-diversity. But we got to be careful the way that's used very often today to end up with a form of uniformity. In other words, diversity is a fraud, the way it's often used. We as Christians are truly in favor of diversity. And then the challenge of how do you have both liberty and diversity together? That's the challenge. But that was on religious freedom, because I think religious freedom, freedom of conscience, is the best way of approaching it. But these books are on freedom itself.
Yeah, well, again, I appreciated that book, and I appreciate what you've, you know, the kind of work that you've done. I didn't appreciate parts of this book, I have to tell you, and I would be surprised if it would actually be read by your political opponents, and you probably think they wouldn't read it anyway, because they, the way that you characterize the left in America then is of people basically who've drunk the Marxist Kool-Aid, and who basically can't be relied upon for any kind of truthful speech, any kind of, it's deceit.
Quote what I'm saying and don't make these sweeping exaggerations, which are not what I believe.
I could.
If you map American politics carefully, you move from the establishment center, which almost has no basis at all, just power and wealth, and you move out to the old-fashioned liberals, whom I really like. I mean, coming from John Stuart Mill, a strong stress on freedom and freedom of speech and the importance of the individual. But that's beginning to collapse because there's no solid grounding for it in a post-Christian age. And then you're moving out, you get more liberal left and then radical left and then cultural Marxist. There's a gradation as you go out. And I'm talking about the extremes which have come in.
I know you are talking about the extremes that are coming in, and what I'm suggesting is that you actually lump a whole bunch of people with the extremes. You know, now you don't do that on the right. When you talk about Dylan Ruth,
I said you're not attacking the right in this book because I don't think they are the present danger.
They're not the present, despite the fact that of January the 6th, one of the most shameful events in modern democratic political history, I would say. And that was done by people on the right. So they're not a present danger at all.
There's no threat of that group taking over anything.
That's very much a matter of opinion, Oz.
All right, sure, certainly.
Yeah, very much a matter of judgment. I mean, maybe this shows where you're coming from, right? Where your sympathies lie politically.
Oh, I critique the right. Believe me, I do. And I've consistently, people say, are you always centrist? Well, I hope I'm doing it from a Christian perspective. But the right is not the current danger.
The right is not the current danger, despite January the 6th. That's just a joke, is it? That's nothing significant, nothing to worry about.
No, if you're a journalist, you're not challenged you. You're making sweeping remarks from Europe that really don't understand what's happening here, I don't think. But I would say follow up the teaching of the writings of Glenn Greenwald and people like that. And there's much more to the story. I mean, do you remember when Russiagate for 2 years was the, quote, assured narrative? And now we know that whole thing, that wasn't the left, that was the establishment. That whole thing was false.
There are a lot of people in the Christian community, of which you are a major spokesman in the United States, who clearly have backed Trump from the beginning, despite his lies, despite the campaign that he did about the birther movement and all of that kind of stuff. They've backed him, they've enabled him, they still back him even now, despite the lies that continue to be told about an election that he claims to have won.
And do you think I agree with any of that? No.
Where is this in the book?
But you've written a book.
I've not written a book. No, I haven't written a book.
You've done films. You cannot address every issue in the book. In a film or a book, you have one thing you're addressing.
You're addressing, aren't you, what you see as the major threat to America?
No, put it this way. Everyone agrees there's a polarization. America's as deeply divided as at any time since just before the Civil War. What is it? Social media? Coastals against the Heartlanders? Nationalists against George Soros? Globalists? No, I say the deepest thing of all is this difference between ideas coming from the American Revolution and ideas coming from the French Revolution. That's what the book's about. Now, in interviews, just as with you now, I've taken on the right. I think evangelicals have done themselves a huge disservice. They've ruined the name of evangelicalism by their uncritical support of Trump. It's been absolutely disastrous. And it goes back to theology. Some are too privatized and some are too politicized. And you could go on. I am a strong critic of the right when that's the point. This book is about the cultural Marxist left.
Okay. Well, I mean, I don't want to labor the point, and I don't want to suggest that you don't take a kind of very serious approach to this. But it seems to me that there are ways in which in this book you use.
Well, America's different because, as you say about the English Revolution, I agree, it's the lost cause. It didn't shape it very profoundly or consistently, and it failed. And you have the nonconformist conscience and Wilberforce and people made a great contribution since then, and that's always there in England, and you have John Stuart Mill and others. But America had a much more developed view of freedom, this ordered freedom I mentioned earlier. Now, I'm not sanguine about where America is. I think it's in very bad shape. But let's drop all that for the moment. Say it collapses here. As I said earlier, can we foresee a future where we as followers of Christ want to fight for societies deeply human, truly just, magnificently free, that have stability and peace? Can we? Well, we've got to ransack the Greeks, certainly, Plato, Aristotle, the Romans, Cicero, and many others since then, including English and American writers. But we've got to put forward a way of doing it, and we've got to fight that the countries we love approach that more. And that's what I'm in favor of. And I think some of the deepest ideas of freedom, the very deepest, you find in books like Exodus and Deuteronomy. And that's why I think we need to ransack these. You know, our Catholic brothers, they went with the Roman way. And when the church became the official religion in 380, it copied Roman structures. And Roman structures, the Caesar, the consuls, the senators, were hierarchical. And you had the Pope, the cardinal, the bishops, hierarchical. And that created all the oppressions and the corruptions we saw in the medieval times. The Reformation, to its credit, as you know, tried, nothing's perfect, to go back to the scripture. And that's when they unearthed freedom and covenantalism and so on. Well, if we want to do better, let's try. But I think we're fighting for humanity in the future over against anarchy and over against the authoritarianism of places like China. So I'm passionate about freedom. I got much more 7 positive things in a book coming out in September. But that's my hope, looking to the future, and I'm sure you and I would overlap on much of that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I certainly agree about the great humanism of Scripture as you've expounded it, and as you've used Jonathan Sacks particularly to kind of illuminate. Thank you very much indeed. We've been talking about Os Guinness's new book, The Magna Carta of Humanity, Sinai's Revolution, Revolutionary Faith and the Future of Freedom. Been talking to an old friend. Thank you so much, Os, for joining us today.
A real pleasure and even a joy, Ewan. So thank you.
And thank you, folks, for joining us. We'll see you again soon for another one of these conversations.